Hello and welcome to this episode of the Debated Podcast. Now, this episode was originally intended as part of a special that would be looking at different ways of parodying the incumbent Prime Minister. Now, unfortunately, events rather overtook the production of this podcast, and Liz Truss's truncated time as Prime Minister meant that the other segments that were going to be part of this podcast weren't recorded. And given that the idea was about parodying the incumbent Prime Minister, now she's gone. That doesn't really work. Anyway, this part of it was recorded with Jake Yapp relatively recently, and it's so good that there's no point in not releasing it. So here we go. This is a podcast on parodying the Prime Minister with myself and Jake Yapp. I hope you enjoy it.
It won't be easy, but we can do it.
We need to wake up and smell the coffee.
The independence case is a powerful one.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
I'm delighted to be joined by the one and only Jake Yapp. Welcome back to the podcast, Jake.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
It's great to have you back. Now, the first question I'd like to ask is, what do you think it is about politicians that so often we find so funny?
Well, I think it's the purpose of comedy is to take something, well, sometimes anyway, is to take something quite toxic and find a way to cope with it. So I think that that's satire when it's good. Whether it's really a good thing, I don't know in the long term, because we shouldn't necessarily be feeling better about this stuff. Where are the pitchforks? I mean, I'm not being funny, but what more has to happen? Where are the pitchforks? Do you know, I looked, just to give you a sense of the way the world has been locked up by government and big business, I genuinely searched on Amazon for a pitchfork, and you can't buy them. You can buy everything on Amazon. All you can buy is like fancy dress plastic tridents that would literally just, Bezos could stop them with his eyeballs because he's cyborg. He's not human anymore. He hasn't been for years, but there's no chance. So, yes, it's sort of easy to mock politicians, but I feel that, satire, I can't remember if we talked about this last time I was here, but that was years ago. We were all young. But, satire can sometimes detoxify something. But that's not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah.
I wonder if what we're going to have now with this hardening of politics and more polarizing politics is stronger, harder satire. Because, we've had for years this paradigm of people saying, well, there's got to be balance in comedy. And, I've been at meetings with broadcasters where, you write some jokes about the government and they'll say, well, for balance, you've got to have some jokes about the opposition. And you think, well, no, because they're not in power. And my job as a satirist is to expose the hypocrisy and lunacy of the people in power. But they've managed to sort of rephrase this on this sort of news footing of, there's got to be balance. I was like, well, no, not at all. But so what's quite liberal? I'm giving you a very long answer to your question. I'm sorry.
No.
Do you want to fit? What's your next question, caller? I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I was enjoying your response. What I was going to follow up with is, satire is something that has existed since, the dawn of time. You go back to the ancient Greeks, you have satirists satirising politicians. But there seems something particularly about modern politicians. I'm thinking of the last three prime ministers that almost from day one seems to lend themselves to satire. Do you think that politicians are becoming almost more comical, or it's easier to satirise them, or do you think it just reflects the kind of people that have been going into politics for the past 20 years?
I think what you. I mean, I genuinely, I never remember anything. So please, I probably said all of this last time. And I've said if you're left wing and you're funny, you just stand up, and if you're right wing and you're funny, you go into politics. And the problem with someone like Johnson was that he was brilliant at comedic misdirection. Now I have read reports suggesting that that whole zip wire event was entirely stage managed. He instructed the operators to get him stuck.
Yeah,
that was the point, because he understood that it would feed into this narrative, and by being this comedic buffoon, he absolutely harnessed the power of comedy to make himself look like this lovable buffoon. What harm could he possibly do? And of course he did catastrophic harm. And so what's really interesting about now, having gone from Johnson, who completely understood the power of comedy and very much levied it to his advantage, we now go to Liz Truss, who I don't know if you've heard her try to tell a joke. It's stunning. I mean, it's truly stunning to listen to. She did one about the wags. I can't remember what it was, but she delivered the punchline and then immediately in the same breath explained the punchline. Thereby killing all of any potential comedy there could have been there. And her understanding of comedy is the same as my understanding of quasi-quateng. Like, there isn't any. And so it's fascinating to see what's going to happen, because she's incapable of even understanding herself in terms of how will this be received by comedians and satirists, or even the public at large. She's a terrible orator. I mean, disastrous. I watched her speech at the conference, and I genuinely thought that, Hacker the dog has better arm movements. Like, you could almost see the chopsticks and the gaffer tape.
Yeah.
Like, it was so bad. So not even comedically, but just as an oration, it was awful. And so when you deal with someone who, A, has no awareness of how to put herself across and no awareness of how it will get savaged by comedians, and B, doesn't care, is the most brazen, balls out, this is what we're doing, and screw you if you don't like it or it doesn't work for you. To return to that in politics, to have this literal attempt to be an analogue of Margaret Thatcher. And that was really the moment when satire, they are like opposing forces. If you're going to raise the stakes politically like that, I think the stakes in satire have to be raised too. And so I do think you're going to see in the next year, as people have to move back in with their parents, if they're lucky, people whose parents will lose their homes. As the housing market crashes, you get negative equity, homelessness goes up, as everything becomes catastrophic in the next year, which, and I take no relish in saying that that's what I genuinely believe we're looking at. People are going to be angrier. They are not going to suffer this gladly. Where are the pitchforks? But in the absence of pitchforks, Spitting Image had better get properly angry again. And there's almost a point, I think, with satire that you almost don't want jokes. Yeah. I don't need jokes. Yeah. I need something that comes from the heart.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of the Spitting Image sketches and songs from the 1980s really were heartfelt, weren't they?
Absolutely.
Do you think, though, that one of the issues for that kind of comedy now is that, I mean, as you say, broadcasters often have a tendency to err on the side of balance. Do you think that that's going to lead to a disconnect between these shows like Spitting Image, the new Spitting Image, and the public, where because they are made by broadcasters that perhaps are a bit nervous about going to the same full throttle degree that Spitting Image did in the 1980s, that the audience is going to feel like, well, why aren't you going harder on them? You feel it still seems like you're not really being as brutal as you can be. Is this gonna create a disconnect between that kind of comedy and the public?
It's really fascinating. Like, this is I think this is a genuinely, I think the Truss era is truly fascinating. And you suddenly realise that, politics are cyclical. Now, we know that, we've always known that, and, people talk about that. But I think this is, for me, within my lifetime, I'm suddenly seeing, oh, comedy is too. We all talked about alternative comedy in the 80s and how it was this revolutionary thing where we stopped having, jokes about mothers-in-law and golf. And suddenly we got, real hard-edged alternative comedy and stuff. And alternative comedy sort of became mainstream, but was still called alternative comedy. And then over the last, I would say, 15 years, maybe 20 years, there's been this slight sense of erosion of that. People have talked about the toothlessness of broadcast comedy satire. And so you think, well, we now need an alternative to alternative comedy because it isn't alternative anymore. It's just gumming fruitlessly on the fingers of politics. And we will probably face the same struggle of getting onto the broadcast media. No one's going to call Michael McIntyre an alternative comedian. You can't. So mainstream comedy exists in a way it almost didn't in the mid to late 80s, where everyone wanted alternative comedy. And so suddenly Jimmy Tarbuck couldn't get a look in. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But we've gone back to Jimmy Tarbuck now, which has its place, I dare say. But what you'll have now, I suspect, is a grassroots movement of angry satire, proper satire, which slowly will permeate into broadcast media because it will get big enough that people can't ignore it, I suspect. Someone will stick their head above the parapet.
Yeah.
The difference being, obviously back in the 80s, there were 4 channels and that was it. The difference is now someone will commit to it, whether that's Netflix or Apple or Paramount or, whoever it may be. Someone will go, well, you know what, we're going to nail our colour to the mast politically, and we're going to say, no, these are the people in power and they deserve to be parodied, and the awfulness of it needs to be pointed out by the court jesters. And they'll do that, and I think they'll do very well. This is genuinely the Truss era, and, at this time of recording, it's like a month old. But the ground shift, when you've got the RSPB, the most middle-class bastion of nice Middle England, putting out incredibly scathing tweet threads about the government and what they're doing to wildlife in this country. Otherwise scrupulously politically neutral bodies suddenly saying, no, wait, no. When they're doing that, you have to look at that culturally and say, well, what's that going to do to comedy? You can't stay doing the kind of, who'd be the worst person to be the Chancellor? Because we got that. You can't play silly parlour games. You need to start getting angry.
Yeah. You mentioned the tweet thread there. To what degree do you think that this kind of comedy is going to emerge on the internet and then filter through maybe into the mainstream?
It will get there. It will have to get there. There are really exciting sort of accelerants. There are some people dumping petrol on the fire. And of all the people, I never saw it coming. I remember in 2008, I did Edinburgh for the first time. And a lot of evenings I would do a guest spot on a thing called the Pink Bus.
Yeah.
And it was lovely. It was a double-decker bus, and you do a gig upstairs. So there couldn't be more than, 20 people in the audience. And they were lovely gigs. It was really nice. And there were a few regulars who did it. There was a woman called Katerina Vrana. And there was another very sweet, soft-spoken guy called Joe Lycett. A little guy called Joe Lycett, ladies and gentlemen, who was just so charming and lovely. And I just adored him. And we became friends. I mean, we're not friends now. He's very big and showbiz, and I wouldn't presume. But he was brilliant then. But, he wasn't doing anything political. But, of course, then he crept up and became a bankable broadcast comedian, but then suddenly got angry. His best friend died during COVID, and the government flouted their own rules, and suddenly they made an enemy of him. And so he had this massive platform and was doing these incredibly political things. Was it the Commonwealth Games he opened?
Yeah.
And said, now it's time to do something our government doesn't always do, which is to welcome some immigrants.
Yeah.
And you think, wow, that was not sanctioned. That was not signed off, was it? You just did that. And that's thrilling to watch someone who has the power and the presence and the platform to suddenly go, nope, I'm doing it my way.
Yeah. In terms of the kind of, I mean, we've discussed some of the attributes of politicians like Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, which make them easy to parody or easy to derive comedy from. What do you think it is about the membership of the Conservative Party that seems attracted to them as purely, or maybe in Boris Johnson's case, not purely, but mainly as serious figures that could lead the nation, that seems perhaps incapable of seeing what the rest of the public can see in terms of the comedicness, the laughability, particularly with Liz Truss?
Yeah. Well, with Johnson, he was brilliant. He knew exactly how to work a crowd. And so they knew they were onto a good thing. He presented as this extremely benign face of, self-centered politics, which is really what the Conservatives are about. You can argue whether that's a good or a bad thing, but that's really the principle of it. Is it's just my money. It's I should decide how much tax I should spend. I'll choose my own healthcare. It's all about the self. With Liz Truss, I mean, I think that was just genuinely one of those. Someone throws three things at you. One is a priceless Ming vase, one is a goldfish, and one is a rotten banana. And your brain's trying to catch all three things and ends up going for the rotten banana, and the other two hit the ground and die. I think it was just a kind of, it was a car crash, do you ever play video games where you're doing a driving game?
Yeah.
Like a driving video game? And you see coming up, like, I don't know, an oncoming lorry, and you're doing 125 miles an hour in your driving game. And you go, I must go to the left of the lorry, or I must go to the right of the lorry. And all your brain can think of is lorry. And you fixate on the lorry and you drive into the lorry instead of left or right. And I think that's what happened with Truss. There was a degree of, should I go for Sunak or should I go for Morden? I went for the thing in the middle. She's a lorry. She's a car crash. She's also. I think they find her exciting. I think they find her thrilling because she's not pretending to be anything other than what she is, which is ironic because she's done more U-turns in her career. But I suppose she's saying, this is the role I'm going to play, and I'm going to commit to it, and I think they love that.
Yeah. In terms of opposition politicians, now you mentioned that earlier, broadcasters sometimes have a tendency of wanting comedians to parody both sides, both the incumbent government and the opposition.
Yeah.
Now, the one thing that has been used in relation to Keir Starmer has been, that he is boring, that he is dull, as a term of a frame of reference of comedy, in a similar way perhaps to John Major counting his peas on Spitting Image. Do you think that in a way that perceived, not necessarily saying it's there, but that perceived lack of flair with Keir Starmer as compared to Liz Truss will mean that comedians will, even if perhaps they may agree with her more than him, gravitate more towards Liz Truss because there is more there to play with and more there to parody and to generate comedy from?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been for a long time in British politics the sort of the bland leading the bland, whereby the most inoffensive person wins. And then Boris Johnson, I think, represented a big swing of, let's have something noticeable. But he played it so brilliantly, and now you say like, okay, well, let's have someone noticeable, and we'll have Liz Truss, and then in the meantime there is the Keir Starmer in the background, and I think he is boring, but I think he should actually lean into that more, because I think people do respond to something that is authentic, and his speech was embarrassing. When he was trying to do jokes, and it was embarrassing because for three reasons. One, he's not very good at it. Two, it wasn't really the time or the place. Wait, that might have been three. No, I can't remember what the third one was. That's politics. So. Well, yeah, no, yeah. Two, he's not very good at it, and three, it didn't feel authentic, and you sort of feel like, well, actually, maybe people would buy more readily into the idea of, well, I'm a grown up, and I'm not going to make jokes when we're dealing with people's lives. There's nothing funny about that, You don't. No one votes for. No one wants an ambulance driver who's really funny. They want someone who takes their job very seriously and does it very well. And you don't really care about whether they're funny or not in their private life. And he should call that, and make a virtue of that. I wished with his speech that he'd said, I had a speech written and it was a standard conference speech. It had a few jokes at the top to warm you up. And then, we'd go into policies and I'd probably tell you about my dad, who was a tool maker. It's like, we've heard it, mate. We've heard that. It's so boring. Lean into it, make a virtue, and say, but now was not the time for that speech. This isn't a time for jokes. This is a catastrophic moment in British history. Call it. Have the authority. Have the presence. Dare not to be funny. And so for comedians, I think looking at Keir Starmer, there's definitely a lot you could do, and he's on the brink of the grey peas kind of John Major Spitting Image trope. Which, if you haven't seen those sketches, if you're young, God, go and see them because they are so funny. So that's why, in a way, I think he needs to own it, turn it into a virtue. Yeah, say I'm not here for jokes. I'm not here for panache or charisma. I'm here to do a job because someone really badly needs to. Yeah, I have to say, I think a good balance is Angela Rayner. I think she's really good at. Do you know what it comes down to is who would you want on a wet lunch? Remember when you were at school? It's a wet lunch, and everyone has to stay and eat their lunch in the classroom. Yeah, it's a wet lunch. Who do you want covering a wet lunch? I'd take Angela Rayner of all the politicians because she'd know exactly how to play it. She'd diffuse the lively ones. She'd see their humour and trump it, or at least kind of go, all right, hey, I see you, very good. And then she'd stamp on the bad behaviour. Whereas can you imagine Keir Starmer trying to manage a wet lunch? Oi, sir! Oi, sir, there's something on your head. What's on my head? It'd be catastrophic. 3 dead, 14 injured.
I think that brings us neatly to my final question, Jake, which is looking at the future of politics and satire in the next 10 years, although it's a very long time off. Where do you think we will be in terms of how politicians use comedy and how politicians are used in comedy? Do you think we're going to go through continue through an era, as you suggested, similar to the 1980s, with the very cutthroat and cutting, spitting image of the 1980s type humour? Or do you think that once we see the back of Liz Truss, that maybe satire might not be quite as cutting?
I think you've chosen a really interesting interval of time, because in 10 years' time, there may well be... the BBC may have changed. I mean, it may well not have done, but I think it's conceivable that the BBC will be a very different entity, and that's going to have a huge impact on British culture generally. If they have the licence fee taken away from them, and I know this because I spoke to the chief financial officer, I think, of the BBC recently. She was walking the dog in my local park. Weird. Anyway, I had no idea, because I know about like BBC Worldwide and how, we sell our shows all around the world, and I sort of thought, well, surely that must bring in enough money now, surely. Yeah. And it turns out it is a drop in the ocean compared to the revenue the BBC gets from the licence fee. Whether you approve of it or not, that's just a fact. And so you're going to have to look at what happens to the BBC. Should the licence fee go? If we don't end up with a sort of Blair-type era where, broadly speaking, the BBC stands a chance. If that goes, and I think it may well do, then I think it's safe until 2027, something like that. But if that goes, well, what's left of the BBC, and you're looking at a vastly reduced service, I mean, massively scaled down. What then happens is the BBC can say, okay, we're a commercial entity, so we'll pursue commercial interests. So maybe we don't care. We don't care what the politicians say. We don't have to take a steer. We don't have to pay lip service to anybody. We can do what we feel is right. We don't have to be all things to all people. And then they can slightly set out their stall and say, well, what do we want our satire to do? Do we speak truth to power? And so if that happens, the cascade from that would be monumental. In a shorter interval of time, I think you are going to get more people feeling more angry. And that may well surface somewhere, somehow. I think a channel somewhere is going to have a kind of, we're not putting up with this anymore moment. Yeah. You can imagine what would happen if, let's say, Dave, sort of pretty big, but not too big that they couldn't have a bit of a punt. Would say, you know what, we've got Paramount Comedy and Comedy Channel and all of those competitors. Well, we're gonna set our stall out. It probably wouldn't be Dave now I think about it. It'd probably be someone like Comedy Central. And say, no, we're going to be the home of proper angry satire. And it could do really well. Yeah. And then what happens with the other broadcasters? Do they pretend that's not happening? Do they take the hit, or do they have to follow suit? So it could be a really interesting time. I think for comedy, we are about to enter by far the most interesting decade we've had in the last 3 decades, for more than 3 decades. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, thank you once again for coming on the podcast, Jake.
Thanks
if
for
people
having me.
want
I
to,
no idea what I said. Anything useful? Hope it was.
If people want to find out more about you or want to follow your exploits, where should they go?
I think they want to find out less. Well, I mean, I'm on the social medias. Do you Instagram? It's at Jake Yapp. And I do that on Twitter as well. And then there's jakeyap.co.uk, I think. It's got links to stuff I do. But, please don't feel obliged.
Excellent. Thank you once again. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbeam, and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter, @DebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.